All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode and event for the Gateway Spotlight series. I'm your host, Brooke Roberts. I am the founder of Inside Study Abroad and Director of International Education at Johnson County Community College in my home state of Kansas. Very proud of that. And we are so excited to be bringing this new series, and I'm very honored that Gateway invited me to host these great conversations. And so for those of you who are joining us, please let us know who you are, where you're chiming in from, and we're going to get this started. We only have about 30 minutes, and so we do want to be able to address your questions at the end and your ideas and thoughts, so please engage with us in the chat. All right, so today we're going to be talking about all things business schools and international education. And so here's how we're framing this conversation. Over the past 2 years, as the global economy was thrust into the realm of online everything, I think we can all relate to that, so too were business schools. And with this changing landscape, business schools have had to reimagine international education that actually prepares graduates for the realities of work in this new COVID era. So in this session, I'm talking with David Sprott and Amir Reza on the new directions and creative approaches business schools are deploying to bring international education online. So welcome everyone. And I just also have to thank our sponsor of our very first episode, took a risk on this new show that we've launched. And our sponsor today is Incendi. Now, if you've never heard of Incendi, they are on a mission to enable universities and business schools to deliver the very highest standards of online and blended education. They offer a unique learning experience platform designed by educators for educators and a range of services to help institutions deliver superior courses. Over the years, Incendi has delivered a platform to equip educators with the most innovative tools to deliver a pedagogically rich, humane-centered learning journey. Everyone needs to say pedagogically rich, humane-centered learning journey 5 times fast. So we're so excited to have Incendi here, and some representatives are going to introduce a little bit about their platform at the end of this workshop and this discussion. So thank you all for sponsoring. Now on to our esteemed panelists. Today we have David Sprott. He's the Henry Y. Hwang Dean and Professor of Marketing in the Graduate School of Management at Claremont Graduate University and is on the faculty at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. We also have Amir Reza. He's the Dean of both Global Education and the Babson Academy for the Advancement of Global Entrepreneurial Learning at Babson College, both of them representing the coast. I've got the Midwest locked down. Let's get into this discussion. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right. So we're going to dive into this conversation and start by setting the stage, especially for those international educators and administrators who aren't as familiar with business schools and how they function. Reza and David, I would love you to help us understand what did international education look like for business school education 20, 30 years ago? Reza, I'll pass it to you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I appreciate being with all of you, and thank you for joining this session. Brooke, that's a great question. And so as I reflect on that through the lens of international education and intersection of business education, what I can think about is you say 20 to 30, and within that you straddle 9/11, which is an important milestone as well. So I would say that certainly we saw growing international student mobility into the US, and business schools were essentially, I think in many ways, if we look at the data, leading in that regard in welcoming international students. So we saw growing numbers. Of course, not September 11th events meant there were some changes in terms of the demographic background of the kinds of students we received. For instance, I think we had so many more students from the Middle East and Saudis in particular right before September 11th and after. And at the undergrad level, we had almost no Chinese students in that era, where it's completely changed, of course. On the education abroad front, I would say that there was less of it in general, but certainly less reliant for faculty-led and more semester long, where that has also shifted over that period of time. I also recall a period where many institutions thought of internationalization, of course, through the discipline, but beyond that, from a strategic institutional perspective, is MOUs. So these hug it out MOUs of you love us, we love you, we'll write this MOU and maybe down the line we'll do something. But they almost never resulted in anything substantive. So there had been shift there. There were certainly regional centers and institutes like Latin American Institute or an Asia center that was leading internationalization, but it was seldom, in my opinion, a comprehensive strategic approach, but rather multiple prongs. In fact, the term comprehensive internationalization, as we know today, there was nothing about that in the literature and how you go about furthering the institution's mission through international education or internationalization 20 to 30 years ago, and has, of course, shifted today.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned that it shifted. David, I want to pass this to you. I'm curious, of course, you can add to what he said about the landscape then, but I would love for you to also touch on what made the shift happen and when did that shift happen? Were there specific incidents happening around the world or a framework that business schools were starting to uncover that the international concept needed to be embedded into the educational experience?
Sure, thanks. I think there's a couple of driving forces. One, with business school deans and folks that run business schools, we're very much focused on the marketplace, whether it's hiring faculty or where our curriculum goes. And so, certainly as international markets opened up and became more important part of the business environment, particularly as technology facilitated a lot of that opened up a lot more interest within the business school to understand things around supply chains and, remote work and those kinds of things, even before we had the COVID times. So I think those business trends have been there recently. Now, more recently in our society, there's been a bit of a trend towards more nationalistic approaches, which I think is a countervailing force. But I would say, I was at Washington State University for a long time, and when we started building the 787 Dreamliner, that plane was built all over the world and assembled in the Puget Sound. So I think as the businesses started to see, gosh, we can do a very different approach. Some like it, some don't like it, but we need to make sure that our students have those trainings and those skills, which is experiential part. They need to be able to interact with other cultures and people from different cultures. The other thing that I think has driven quite a bit of it is our accrediting bodies. So the two big accrediting groups out there are ACSB in the United States and then EQUIS EFMD internationally. And if you look at the number of schools that are accredited on both places, there's about 900 ACSB schools. The vast majority of those are from the United States. EFMD on the other side are all international schools, and they're trying to push their accrediting into the other markets. So ACSB has a big push for international schools, and vice versa. EFMD is trying to make progress into the United States. So I think that has also shifted focus as well as we start to think, I'm going to be doing a trip next year to Israel to help with accreditation. I did one in Taiwan last fall. So I think it's just opening up the leadership's mind of these schools to say, wow, there are a lot of opportunities out there internationally. The other quick thing I'll mention, though, that is, and I think this is a force against international work, which is sad to me, is there's so many things that have to be in our curriculum from either our accrediting bodies in the United States or from, our local alumni. And when you need to cover ethics and DEI and emerging technology and just go down the list, let alone accounting, finance, marketing, and finance, the core, how do we integrate that in a meaningful way and in a cost-efficient way that's going to draw students to us? So I think that's a part where it gets a bit more complicated.
Yeah, in my experience working at universities and advising students on study abroad specifically, I think that's a really good point. I used to always say, the fine arts and STEM, so hard to find, the right courses because it was so prescribed, their degree program. And then I always then had to add on business because, it seems like it should be easy to study abroad, but it's really not because it is so prescriptive. And so I think that's a really important thing. It kind of leads us to our next topic or question here is how have business schools approached international education maybe differently than the other areas of study, other colleges throughout the campus? I know Babson is a business school, as well as Claremont. I believe Claremont is a business school as well, but your other experience at institutions that had a broad spectrum of majors, do business schools have a different approach, and what are the unique challenges? I think we talked about curriculum, but any other unique challenges to embracing international ed?
So I can jump in on that one. So I'm part of an organization that promotes international business education. It's about a group of 40 universities. I can put the name of it in the chat box if anyone's interested. And we have schools anywhere from, a very small schools like Rollins College and Richmond. I saw someone was here from Richmond, all the way up to big state institutions like South Carolina, Oklahoma, Hawaii. And, I think for me, one of the big factors is if you don't have a strong culture of internationalization at the university or within the student body, the headwinds that make it difficult to get students abroad are even harder. So a place like Northeastern University, one of I assume your competitors, probably Amir, they're top to bottom after that, the president that really focused on that, international. And same way with Brigham Young University, they teach, 100+ languages. And when you have that kind of a culture, it's a whole lot easier to get to some level of international expectation because the students are naturally kind of drawn to that. So I think for those that don't have that, it's particularly difficult. And I've been at institutions like that. Previously, I was at University of Wyoming. And, it's not a very international state, as you might expect. And so to try to get an undergraduate student there to say, yes, I want to do a semester abroad is particularly difficult. Now, I think on the business side, we can make a pretty strong case that you're going to be better in the business world if you have these experiences. So I think there's a more closely aligned value proposition to what you'll do in life. And this group that I'm part of is called Quibi. We're doing a research project on the value of IB education. And, we've got some pretty strong data that, recruiters and the kind of job you're going to get is going to be enhanced by international experience, just no doubt about that. But how to articulate that to the student and to the parent and say, okay, you need to do this over an internship or in addition to an internship or other activities you're involved with, that can be a little more difficult.
Yeah. Reza, did you want to chime in? Amir,
yeah,
sorry.
I want to also just briefly, I totally agree with David about the previous question as well. I think that the globalization of commerce pushes at business schools, of course, in the early stages, and then what you have accreditation. But beyond that, I think if we're being honest, that in many ways, the global inbound demand of international students into the US was largely in the business disciplines. So business schools saw this as an opportunity to create more access to international students, but also it came with international students paying tuition, which helped business schools, right? So if we're being honest about that. In addition to that, of course, faculty research became more internationalized in some regard in that period. But then some schools were thinking about things like branch campuses, dual degrees. Those all fall under the internationalization that I think that business schools saw it as. In some ways, if you're a business school that is not internationalizing in the eras of the 2000s to 2010s, you do it so at your own peril, because business and commerce is globalized in nature, so your curriculum falls behind. So how do you prepare the next generation of business leaders and change makers to understand that global context? And I think we started to see some also fine tuning, whether it's AACSB or others, AAC&U and others, clarifying what do we mean about global learning. So there was a bit more language and concreteness as to what we mean by intercultural competence or global competence and why it relates to business education, so that faculty could embrace that in concrete ways as opposed to what I would say regional studies or language studies or country studies, right? These attributes that we want our students to have so that they can thrive in different environments, whether it's in Boston or New Delhi.
Okay, so I'm going to throw a curveball. This is not a question, but it just sparked an idea here. So I would love to know both of your opinions now on, I know that international business is a commonly a major in business schools. I flirted with international business for a hot second. I have many friends who studied international business. Is that now redundant if you're going to a business school that has integrated internationalization into the broader curriculum for all business students? Is majoring in international business redundant? I guess that's, I'm just going to stick it there with that.
So I mean, I think you're describing utopia.
Oh, okay.
That you know, in essence, in some ways, even in the international education field, we say if we were wildly successful, the international education office becomes obsolete, because so much of what we do is integrated into the fabric of the campus that you don't need an international office, right? Or if DEI is incorporated into every aspect of an institution, you don't need a DEI officer or senior officer, right? So we're not there yet. Mm-hmm. But in many ways, at a place like Babson, students don't major in anything but, as undergraduates at least, in business administration, but certainly they have pathways. And all of them are going to receive some aspect of global learning. But there are those who are both primed to and accelerate in global learning because of the exposure they receive, because of the global nature of the student body, the faculty, and what they're exposed to through their experience. And we want to be able to have pathways for them to accelerate and build scaffolding for them, right? And that's not a one size fits all, because if we went down that path, I think there might be more resistance. And there are some impediments. For instance, some of the students come and they want to do, let's say, they want to sit for the CPA, become accountants. Those sequential pedagogies and course structures are not easy to then build a study abroad experience or global learning through. Although I'm convinced with virtual, we could do some of that, but there are impediments. So I think that we're not quite there where I would say, yeah, if we've reached that global accessibility for all, so then why do we need an international business major?
Yeah.
I would just quickly add, I think it depends upon who you ask. If you talk to, you know, South Carolina or Thunderbird, Northeastern, that's really FIU down in Miami, what's the role of the IB major? I think they would pretty clearly say this is a unique field of study that requires its own coursework content. And I think that's probably true. I just think it's going to be hard to infuse international throughout the entire curriculum so that it becomes it's going to be unnecessary. It could happen, but for those of you that work with business faculty, we like what we like. And, if I'm said, well, you got to have some international in there, it's like, well, I'll get to it. That's chapter 15 of the basic marketing book or finance book. And it's like, yeah, we'll cover that one day at the end of the term. So I think that, depending upon how integrated your faculty are with that internationalization is going to be critical. And I think by having a separate IB faculty, a separate department, I think that can really further that passion for internationalization. And at least the ones that show up in the top rankings, they typically are going to have a separate group of people trying to push that ball up the hill with international work. Mm-hmm. But like you said, in a utopia, it would be wonderful if we had this in all of our schools. I really think we would be better off.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I just wanted to spice up the conversation a little, see if we had any controversy going on here. So let's talk a little bit, Amir, you segued this nicely when you mentioned that if we can incorporate online components, virtual components, that you could internationalize very specific regimented degree programs. So let's start talking about the online arena of all of this. I want to set the stage with a little anecdote from my own experience. So way back in 2002, when I was a sophomore in college, I remember I had some friends who were all in this class, and they went to the lecture, and on the screen were a bunch of students in a Polish class in Poland. And I think they were taking marketing or something like that. Today, I think we would call this COIL. They had discussion groups online, and obviously they had the visual exchange going on. And I just remember thinking, that's so cool. And I was studying international relations, and we didn't have that in the poli-sci department. And I just thought it was so fascinating. So that was 20 years ago. And for me, I always thought business schools were the first movers on this. They were the ones to embrace this type of technology and this type of integration with other classrooms around the world. So my question for you all is, have business schools been first movers on this? And what made them want to engage in this type of COIL model, even long before the pandemic really began?
Would you like to go, Dave?
Oh, no, you can go. Okay, I can start. Well, I think for me, I think my first response would be that it's driven by the nature of work. We have so many of our businesses today that are global in almost every regard, that you're going to be working internationally in a remote work setting like what we have now during COVID. And that's been going on ever since technology has supported that, once we kind of moved into the new century a little before. So I think that's probably driven a lot of the interest in that. And I would say that from what I can see, COVID has accelerated that, with more firms and businesses and entities getting much, much more involved with that compared to where it was. There's an academic, I just looked, there's one called X Culture. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's a professor who started this group work between two different universities where students can work on a project. And that started in 2010. And that was pretty early. I mean, that was 12 years ago. And I've met with him a few times. And I think the initial idea was, how can we leverage technology and the way students work with existing relationships to help enhance that educational experience? Now, I will also say, I think a lot of faculty, and I think students too, still expect that, experience at some point. They want to get on the ground. But I think there's a much bigger realization now that that's not the only way to get an international experience in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and I would add that I guess I'm a bit, I'm not sure that business schools necessarily led the way in this regard. I think there were a lot of pockets of hesitancy in business schools because of faculty just not seeing virtual as the answer or having a lack of comfort with it. Where we saw success, I think there were small pockets of experiments that deans and other administrators helped with particular faculty who were keen on this to lead. So for instance, when I arrived at Babson in 2000, we already had what we called a fast track. It was essentially a blended learning MBA. What it afforded us to do is be in multiple locations and not have to have faculty housed there, right? Mm-hmm. So the virtual facilitated some of the business objectives of the business school, but I don't know that it was led with the vision that the future is virtual, right?
Yeah.
But certainly that built on experiments that today we see, and that everybody could see that virtual was going to be part of the equation of learning, and global learning included. But there were lots of people dragging their heels along the way, and the pandemic was almost like, well, it's sink or swim. We've got to figure this out. We've got to learn overnight how to deliver this so that we can. Well, why not extend that to global learning as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. So we're running out of time as we predicted. And so I want to give you both an opportunity to brag a little bit on some initiatives that either your institutions or organizations you're involved with have deployed over the last couple of years, or even before the pandemic era, if you will, in terms of utilizing the online tools and platforms to facilitate international education within your institutions. And so while you guys think about that, I'm going to ask the audience also, if you have questions for our panelists, please drop them in the chat. And also in the chat, we'd love to hear, what are your predictions for the future? What do you think international education is going to look like, especially when it comes to this blended idea of virtual and online and in person and abroad and all the things? What do you think it's going to look like in 10, 20, 30, 100 years? So throw those in the chat. And so we're going to have our sponsor say a few words as well. And then we'll have our panelists brag a little bit, and then we'll jump into some Q&A. So I want to introduce Brian Mahoney, who is representing Incindy, who I introduced at the top of the show. And Brian, tell us a little bit about Incindy and how you guys work with business schools.
Sure. Actually, in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is just thank everyone for coming, because I think what's going to be more valuable for everyone are the questions and hearing a little bit from Amir and Dave, what they're doing and the predictions for the future. So, wow, this has been fantastic. Thank you to Gateway. Brooke, great job as moderator. Amir and David, thank you so much for all your comments. And I'll step aside and thank everyone for coming and let the conversation keep going.
Thanks, Brian. All right, Amir.
Sure.
Hot seat
I
for
will
you.
be very
Brag.
quick. I know we're short on time. So broadly, I think cool virtual opportunities for our students, whether it was faculty led that was turned online or virtual exchanges that we didn't imagine before. But then through the Babson Academy, we launched in October 2020 a new webinar, monthly webinar called the 1 Hour Entrepreneurship Educator Series, where I invite a different professor to give us the download on their pedagogical approach and latest research. So later this month is about gamification in the classroom. And we have had roughly 1,800 participants from 80 countries in those webinars since October 2020. I would not have imagined this program or launched it without the pandemic pushing me to do so. But it's been wildly successful in relation to global engagement.
That's really cool. Thanks. David?
Yeah, so I just joined the Drucker School here about 9 months ago, so I'm a relatively new person to California, but the ability to do things virtually now has been really so impressive. We're going to be doing a joint conference with a school in Portugal called ASE, and it never would have happened as quickly or as efficiently. It'll be here in April, and if anybody's interested, just drop me a note and I can tell you about it. But we're going to have a partnership with an institution from across the world that we never would have had before to build out relations internationally. And I intend to do a lot more of those, and I think a lot of our institutions can benefit from doing that.
Agreed. Well, if you are watching or in the audience, we'd love to know your predictions, but I'm going to have our panelists also share a little bit. And the predictions don't necessarily have to be all roses and sunshine. I'm sure we're going to see some road bumps ahead or challenges that arise that we're going to try to predict, but we really can't. And so I love it if Amir and David and Brian as well, if you want to chime in what you're seeing at Incendi, some predictions for the future. Here, can I give one of my predictions? My prediction is that business education in the traditional university setting is going to see so much more competition with outside organizations that are supplying certificates and work-based learning and education that doesn't require a 4-year college degree or the tuition that often comes with that. And I think we're going to see more and more of that challenging higher education in general, but specifically business education.
Well, I can answer that question from Incendi's perspective. We work with institutions around the world focusing on business curriculum, and we see so much more collaboration and content sharing. David, you had mentioned early in the conversation how there were some courses and content that are just hard to put into a course, but put into a program. The ability to share that and create those efficiencies is what's unlocking a lot of opportunity for the people that we work with, for the schools we work with. It's pretty interesting to see.
I would agree with you in general, Brooke. I think there are still going to be plenty of learners who want the traditional learning pathways, especially at the undergraduate level with, I think, great institutions and what they have to offer. But beyond that, growth is going to be limited to, I think, learners who want smaller chunks of learning. They want but longer engagement, lifelong learning, but in smaller chunks and just in time and relevant to that era. And how we reimagine the makeup of our faculty and our structures to deliver that is still a tale to be told, and it has many challenges. But I do think that you're onto something, because essentially what we're trying to do is help create future leaders. But we also need to be honest that the jobs of the future don't yet exist. So we don't really know the curriculum to be able to bring to bear. But what we do know is that if we can prepare learners to adapt to ambiguous, uncertain situations like the pandemic and be able to actually thrive even despite those circumstances. Those are skills that are real and will be relevant for some time to come. And then finally, I do think that the learners abroad, especially related to international education, will more and more find regional and local universities who are AACSB accredited, EQUIS accredited, and may be hesitant to come here for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so partnerships with institutions where we are delivering a portion of their curriculum because of the expertise or the excellence that we have could be another way where we extend our reach and access for learners, but not in the traditional degree format.
That all is great stuff, and I agree. I would just throw one more in there just for consideration, and it's kind of the impact in society around business operations, whether it's DEI, sustainability, poverty, all the things that are really front and center and very clear at a global level. ACSB in particular, businesses as well, are really pushing, what is the nature of the business's impact on broader society. And that's going to be something that's going to be driven more into our curriculum education and programming, and I think perfectly aligned with international globalization activities. And with the Gen Z students coming along, I've got 2 of them in my family. I just think that that's going to be a game changer as they get to college and really say, you know what, we're not doing this the way you guys did it for a long time. I think that'll be a big change.
Well played to bring up Gen Z right at the tail end. So we can't dive into that. We're at the half-hour mark. This is great. I think we could probably go on for another hour talking about all the different ideas and initiatives you guys have brought up. Thank you so much, both of you, for being on this panel today. We have Dr. Amir, Reza, and Dr. David Sprott. I know several people have asked for contact information. Y'all go look them both up on LinkedIn. They are there. Say hi over there on LinkedIn. But of course, you're both welcome to drop your contact information below. And I want to again thank Cindy and Brian. And I'm sorry, Craig, you didn't get your moment in the spotlight from Cindy here sponsoring this event. And thank you all so much for being here. We will be back in about 2 weeks, actually 2 weeks, on March 2nd. We're going to be talking about the 12 big questions your study abroad office needs to be asking when making a decision about running study abroad programs in the future. And we're going to have a couple of panelists talking about those 12 important questions. So if you want to know what those are, you have to show up live in 2 weeks. Thank you all again so much for being here. I'm Brooke Roberts, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye now.
Thank you.